Okay, today we are going to connect three things that, on the surface, seem to have absolutely nothing to do with each other. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, a bizarre racist flaw in 20th century X-ray machines, and a modern medical mystery that doctors are still grappling with. It turns out, they're all part of one unbroken chain, a chain that stretches from the distant past right into our lives today.
So our whole investigation really kicks off with this one very specific and honestly pretty baffling question. For decades, the medical data has been crystal clear. Black populations living in the Western Hemisphere have way higher average blood pressure than Black populations in Africa. So what on earth could possibly explain that?
To get to the bottom of this, we kind of have to put on our detective hats. We're going to be piecing together clues from history, from biology, and even from technology. And our very first clue, it's sitting right there in the data.
Now have a look at this. The difference we're talking about is consistent and it is stark. Researchers have found at least 6 different populations in Africa with remarkably low blood pressure. But here's the kicker. In the entire Western Hemisphere, among all the Black populations, not a single low blood pressure population has ever been found. This isn't just a coincidence, it's a pattern, and it's screaming for an explanation.
And that pattern brings us to our first major clue. It's a really powerful and, I should say, pretty controversial theory. It suggests that the answer doesn't lie in our modern world, but hundreds of years in the past. It's called the slavery hypothesis.
So the basic idea here is that the transatlantic slave trade was so unbelievably brutal, so deadly, that it acted like this intense evolutionary filter. It was, for all intents and purposes, a massive natural selection event, where only people with a very specific genetic trait were likely to survive and pass that trait down to their kids.
And to really wrap your head around the scale of this selection pressure, you have to start with the numbers. We're talking about more than 12 million people captured and forced from Africa, packed onto ships, and sent to the Americas.
Now this number is just staggering. Historians figure that about a third of those 12 million people died before they even reached the Americas. That's during the capture, the forced marches to the coast, and of course the horrific Middle Passage. When you have a mortality rate that high, you create an incredibly intense environment for natural selection.
So what was it that decided who lived and who died on those journeys? Well, the historical records, things like ship's logs, they paint a really grim picture. The biggest killers were things like diarrhea, they often called it the flux, along with raging fevers and vomiting. And what do all those things have in common? They all cause a catastrophic loss of salt and water from the body, leading to fatal dehydration.
Okay, so this is a crucial point. In that horrific environment, if you were an individual whose body was genetically better at retaining salt, you had a huge survival advantage. Your body could hang on to that precious salt and water, making you much more likely to survive the voyage and eventually have children. But here's the twist. That same life-saving trait becomes a major liability today. In our modern world, with our high-salt diets, that same ability to retain salt contributes directly to high blood pressure. What was once a biological advantage has become a modern vulnerability.
But the story doesn't end there. This legacy isn't just biological. It actually seeped into the very tools of modern science, embedding a deep racial bias into the cold, hard logic of the machine itself.
I know it sounds completely unbelievable, but this is a documented historical fact. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, it was standard procedure, part of the formal training for X-ray technicians in the US, to intentionally give their Black patients higher doses of radiation than their white patients.
And if you look at this timeline, you can see this wasn't some fringe idea. It started with some pseudo-scientific beliefs back in the 1890s. By the 1940s, it was being taught as fact in technical schools. And by the 1960s, it was recommended in textbooks and even by major companies like General Electric. It took over 70 years before Ralph Nader finally exposed it in Senate hearings, which brought the practice to an end in 1968. 70 years! This table, from an industry journal in 1957, is just chilling. It perfectly captures the mindset. Just look at the classifications. Whites are listed as normal. That's the default human. But Black or brown patients, they're listed as a deviation that needs an adjustment, lumped into the same category of abnormality as the extremely obese.
So you have to ask yourself, what kind of thinking makes it possible to see an entire group of people as so fundamentally different that you think their bodies require a different setting on a machine? Well, the root of that idea takes us all the way back to the plantation. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and became one of this country's most brilliant thinkers, he absolutely nailed the core logic of the system back in 1855. He said slavery reduces man to a mere machine. And that wasn't just a powerful metaphor. He meant it literally. It was the system's operating principle.
Scholars have a name for this ideology. They call it plantation energy. It was a complete reimagining of what a human being is. Enslaved people were no longer seen as people. They were seen as power sources, as units of energy, just like a mule or a steam engine, to be managed, measured, and extracted for maximum profit.
And this way of thinking actually evolved right alongside technology. On the early plantations, the enslaved body was viewed as a source of metabolic energy, like a farm animal. But when steam power and industrial machines arrived, the logic got even harsher. The human body was now expected to work at the same relentless, mechanical pace as the engine itself.
And the most brutal form of this was something called the pushing system on cotton plantations. This wasn't just random cruelty. It was a calculated, systematic regime of torture. The whip was used as a tool to literally calibrate human bodies, forcing them to pick cotton faster and faster to meet ever-increasing daily quotas. It was, as one historian put it, a system that used torture as its central technology.
Okay, so now let's pull all of these different threads together. We've got a potential biological legacy, a biased piece of medical technology, and a deeply dehumanizing ideology. These are not separate stories. They are all links in one single unbroken chain. So here's how it all locks together. First, you have the ideology of plantation energy, which created the whole framework for seeing black bodies as something other than human, as tools or machines. That framework then made it possible for biased medical practices like the X-ray race correction to seem perfectly logical and scientific for decades. And finally, the brutal reality of that system of extraction, the forced marches, the diseases, the deadly dehydration, that's what created the exact evolutionary pressures that could have left a real biological legacy that we can still measure today in hypertension rates. Ideology, practice, biology, all connected.
In the end, it leaves us with this really profound and unsettling thought from the scholar Ian Bochum. He wrote that the time of transatlantic slavery isn't really over. Instead, it accumulates in the cargo holds of the present. What he's saying is that the echoes of that history aren't just out there in society somewhere. They're carried inside our very bodies, even now.